about a decision that I was trying to make. I honestly don't remember what the decision was about anymore, but it must have felt risky. Because Elizabeth said that a decision like that feels risky is like jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. We jump, trusting that God is going to catch us before we hit the ground. Now, I quipped that that was a real leap of faith. She didn't laugh either. I also remember thinking I had no idea if I could ever or would ever be willing to do something like that. Well, the story we heard from Mark's Gospel this morning is often called the widow's mite. A woman approached the temple, and she was following those who were wealthy, who were dropping large amounts of money into the temple collection. Now, in those days, there wasn't a lot of paper money, so they were dropping a lot of coins. And you could hear the clink, 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 clink. And then these wealthy were giving out of their abundance, which means out of their discretionary income. The money that they didn't need to pay the mortgage, or to buy food, or pay for health insurance, or any other bills. And the wealthy in those days were like Bill Gates wealthy, compared to us anyway. And they had more than enough to give. They didn't have to think about stretching their budget, taking sacrifices, or even leaps of faith when they put large amounts of money into the collection. They had a lot of discretionary cash. And when it was her turn, the widow put in her 2 little pennies. Clink, clink. She gave everything she had to God's work in the temple. The woman took a leap of faith and gave everything she had to live on into the collection. Now, this passage comes up a lot during stewardship campaigns, as we used to call it in seminary, when we learned how to fleece the flock. And the point of this is if the widow could sacrifice everything she had to give to God's work in the temple, the rest of us schlubs could pony up more than we do. If we want Jesus to really admire us, we'd better give a whole lot higher percentage of our income to the church. If we're worried about our household budget or have to wait to buy something else we really want, well, too bad. Do what the widow did. Give everything you've got and make Jesus proud. In other words, this passage was used to create guilt in the hearts of all of us when we give to the church. And if we felt guilty about what we did or did not give to the church, well, we better start feeling guilty. After all, look at this widow. She gave everything she had. She took a leap of faith. Why can't we? What's our problem? Now, please note that if guilt worked, I would use it every time. But guilt does not work. In fact, most of us learn to resent feeling guilty. We resent feeling guilty about what we do or do not do. We resent feeling guilty about our abilities or lack of them. And we really resent feeling guilty about what we give to the church. Now, sadly, this story has been used as a giant guilt stick to beat people's consciences because, well, most of us preachers believe that the text really is about money. I always thought it was about money, and I knew guilt didn't work, so as far as I can remember, I never used that passage. Tried others. Twist an arm or two. Unfortunately, that passage has not been translated correctly. While Jesus spoke the local language of Aramaic, the Gospels were first written in Greek. It was the common language for writing of the day. And if we read what Jesus said in Greek, he didn't talk about the widow giving all she had. Instead, he said, she gave her whole life. When she gave all the money she had, she gave her whole life. Her whole life. And her leap of faith was not quite as financially risky or hazardous as most of us have been taught to believe. After all, as a Jewish widow in first century Jerusalem, the temple would have reached out to care for her. If she had no food, the temple priest would have made sure she had enough to eat. If she had no place to live, the men in her family would have provided shelter for her. If she was sick, the community would have rallied around her to nurse her back to health. So she knew that in giving all she had, she'd really be okay. And let's face it, most of us don't have that kind of safety net in our lives. If we gave everything we have to the church and then expected the congregation or the denomination to take care of us, boy, would we be in for a surprise. That would be a leap of faith where we would end up in a heap on the ground. In fact, most of us would look at somebody who had given everything they had to the church and kind of shake our heads in alarm. Or we'd think, man, how foolish. Or we'd look at them with a little bit of judgment. What are they trying to do? Get stuff for free? Most of us would wonder how someone could be so irresponsible. I mean, haven't we all looked at those end-of-life prophets who encourage people to give them everything they have, end-of-the-world prophets, who encourage people to give them everything they have, and they do, then the end of the world doesn't come, and we look up and think, man, were you an idiot? How could you have been so stupid? Well, we kind of would look at each other the same way if we all decided to empty our bank accounts and every month turn over our Social Security to the church. We'd think, man, how could you be so stupid? Well, the widow's leap of faith was not about money because she knew she'd be cared for. Her leap of faith was her willingness to put God and God's work first in her life. Bless you. She gave her whole self to God because she believed that was how she could best put God first in her life. In other words, she was all in for God. And again, when we think about our lives in 2019, giving our whole life to God feels like an amazing challenge, a huge challenge. And if we decided to give our whole lives to God, what would that look like? What kind of leap of faith would we have to take? Well, I believe that giving our whole lives to God starts by admitting that we are entirely and completely dependent upon God. And being entirely and completely dependent upon God is radical humility. Giving our whole lives to God means saying and admitting that we have been blessed in such a way so that we have everything we are and everything we have. Any measure of success we have had in life is because God has blessed us with the abilities we need that allow us to earn a living, raise a family, or rent or own a home. And anything we give back to God in our time, our abilities, our money, are possible only because God has allowed us, by blessing us, to have those things first. And let's face it, in today's culture, admitting that we believe that we are entirely dependent on God for who we are and what we have is radical humility. Most of the people around us and most of the messages we get in our culture is that we are to be self-made. That everything we have is because we've worked hard to earn it. And if people don't have other stuff, it's because they haven't worked hard to earn it. Everything we are is because of the personality and character we have developed. And people who seem to have lesser character, we don't think about the environment in which they grew up. We don't think about the genetics and the DNA of which they are made. We just think they haven't developed their character. In the minds of a lot of people, we are all self-made. And it's a leap of faith to try to explain to those folks that we believe that we have been blessed with certain abilities by God. And that, yes, we have developed those abilities. We have done our best to use those abilities that benefit not just ourselves, but those around us, God's people and God's creation. And we've done that because we are so incredibly grateful to God for richly blessing us, for giving us so much in blessings, that we have been given through birth what it takes to be able to move forward in this world. That we are so grateful to God for the gift of Jesus our Christ. We are so grateful to God that we have been forgiven. We are so grateful to God that we get second chances in this life and new life in the next. We're so grateful to God that we wanted to develop our skills. We wanted to develop those blessings, and we want to give back to God's people and God's creation as a way of saying thank you. Try to explain that to somebody who believes they're self-made. And it's taken a leap of faith. Because a lot of people will look back at us and say, sorry, I've earned everything I have. I've made myself into who and what I am. God didn't have so much to do with it. Giving our whole lives to God is admitting God gave us our whole life. And when we give back to God, giving our whole life means then giving that first time, that first money, those first talents back to God. You might have heard me ripping out the envelope this morning. That sound. I thought, well, that was loud. Well, that's because I like on Sunday morning to write the first check of the week to God, to remember that it all comes from God. And it affects our attitudes when we remember that. Everything we have and everything we are is a gift from God. Giving our whole lives means sometimes saying yes to God when God asks us to step beyond our comfort zone. Saying yes to God, even when it feels like we're jumping out of the plane without the parachute. Saying yes, that we know only the grace of God is going to protect us. That's giving us our whole lives to God. Anybody else both excited and terrified about the building renovation? I am. I am. That's why I always pray that, God, if this is what you want us to do, help us. And if it's not, please stop us. Well, God hasn't stopped us yet. That doesn't mean I'm not both excited and terrified. When we look at that building renovation, we are jumping out of a plane without a parachute, friends. And sometimes that's going to mean that we have to look at our own lives and say that we have been blessed by God with everything we have and everything we are. And sometimes, like the widow, that's going to involve sacrifice. Sometimes, like Jesus, sacrifice is what it's going to take. Every time I think about it, I get excited and then I get terrified. But maybe, that's the plane God is asking us to jump out of. As a group, we'll figure that out. As a group, we'll decide that at our special church conference on March 14th. April 14th. The widow put her last 2 coins in the collection of the temple. And she did so much more than give all she had. She gave her whole life. Maybe it's time for us to think about what giving our whole lives to God would look like. Maybe it's time to be excited and terrified and take that leap. And each of us knows what that leap is for us in our own lives. Each of us knows what that would feel like, what that decision is about. Each of us knows. But maybe, just maybe, it's time to take a leap and trust that God's going to catch us before we hit the ground. Amen.